Excellent, thank you. Thank you, Cara DeEduardo at Cooper East in New York City. Thank you, San Francisco Public, Rob Saunders, and the team over at Letterform Archive, where I spent most of the entire day, since about 10 a.m. So I'm tired, but I had a macchiato, so we'll get through this together. In the archive today, that many of the images that we'll see tonight, at least in the intro, which is about 20 slides, those actual materials are at the archive. So while I'm happy you're here and you're looking at the images on the screen, go to the archive, go see the real thing, much better. Okay, so tonight's talk will talk about kinetic typography. Kinetic typography, as I'm defining it tonight, relating to from motion. With only a few exceptions, we'll be focusing on the way graphic designers express using printed, client-driven only commercial graphic design. No fine art, no video, no animation, no Saul Bass film title sequences, printed paper tonight, and I should mention everything is pre-computer, with the exception of possibly the last slide. Much of the material is type, with some examples of hand lettering, international in scope, and range basically from 1911 or so up until the early 1970s, with the bulk of the material being mid-century. Some of that inspiration comes from the book that I published that Rob mentioned. So my choices are certainly narrow, opinionated, and subjective. When I started the talk, to prepare for the talk, I think I had about 260 slides. Don't be alarmed. Tonight there's about 75 or so. So we'll move through them fairly quickly. My interest in the subject matter and my attempt to kind of organize this modern phenomena really comes from my dialogue and my discussion with my students, who use kinetic typography in a contemporary sense all day long. But when I talked to them about it, there was little awareness of the history of these ideas, where they came from, the historical context surrounding them, some of the technologies that made them happen, and mostly the progression of this idea of kinetic typography. So, for example, a very quick, before I came here, browse online reveals a massive amount of spectacular, in my opinion, kinetic typography. Yet, there's little context to what we're looking at. And what is especially alarming to me, since I teach graphic design history, is we see historical next to the contemporary. So somebody quickly browsing a Pinterest or an Instagram and looking at kinetic typography, there's little separation between old and new. So this is important to me to try to talk a little bit about the historical appreciation tonight. So it's not a practical talk on how to do kinetic typography. It's more of an elementary historical appreciation. So let's start with futurist photography and its dynamic motion studies. This is a good place to start. Although, given more time, we could easily talk about the Cubists. We could talk about Lewis Carroll. We could talk about Mallarmé, which I saw today. We could talk about Muybridge. We could talk about Impressionism. We could talk about incunabula. Not enough time for any of that, so we will start with the Futurists at about 1911. Brigaglia was an Italian futurist photographer influenced by Marinetti and many of the futurist painters. He and his brother helped sensation and dynamism in photography. They called the method photodynamism, focused on capturing the energy and the feeling of the movement in the photos. So here shown is a man in a continuous motion from a seated position to one where he's leaning forward. And the artist, Brigaglia, described the trajectory motion as one that which exerts a fascination over our senses. So, a good place to start. The futurist painters also shared similar 20th century explorations about movement and motion, modern symbols in the new modern age, particularly Giacomo Balla, the Italian painter, who was familiar with the previous photographer's work. In his stunning and complex artwork titled Disruption and Speed, Penetration of Car Dynamics, he celebrates his fascination with the automobile, an emblem for new technology, speed, movement, and modernity. Here we see abstract, shifting fragments of an automobile in motion, its wheels, the driver, the clouds of dust, all representing as a whole sound, velocity, movement, light. Marinetti, who we may know, published Zang Tum Tum, a sound concrete poem in 1912. This collection of poetry is an account of a battle that he experienced on the battlefield, including the sounds of gunfire, explosions. His playful and provocative words in freedom, or free word parole and libertaire, introduced a new painterly and expressive typographic design. Base-charged poetry, Marinetti defied correct syntax and grammar. He liberated the words through animating them with explosive, dynamic, and non-linear compositions. Apollinaire, the French poet, published early expressions of type with his poem The Rain in 1916. He called these new experiments calligrams and poems meant to work visually, verbally, and auditory. The letter forms, free of any normal linear reading, arranged to form a visual design on the page, and we see here them sprinkling figuratively down the page, possibly, presumably, like the sensation of rain falling. Apollinaire's fusion of poetry and painting connects the visual form with poetic content. Léger, the French painter, explored his own unique expressive typography. In 1919, he illustrated this fast-paced, filmic expression of Sendrar's novel. Léger was fascinated by modernity and by the chaotic rhythms of the cityscape, the street signs, the noise, the movement, the light. And this is evident in his work. This work is using innovative early uses of stencil lettering, drawings, and fragments of colliding images and text. Here's an advertisement by the great Dadaist, John Hartfield, and published in Berlin's short-lived anti-war journal called New Youth. It displays Dada's raw and chaotic typography, lacking functionality to a certain degree. This particular ad announces his friend and colleague's recent published collection of original lithographs, George Gross. The Russian avant-garde also saw common traits in Futurism and Dada. This 1919 cover for Miliork, a collection of poems and avant-garde texts designed by an artist